I do think as individuals and professionals, each of us needs to always be learning, and we need to continually educate ourselves and even set goals about what we're going to educate ourselves about. For example, set a goal to understand better what the risk is from quantum computing and how these new algorithms work and how you might be able to begin the process to move to those. That will require education, just as we've had to learn about AI, each of us.
This is KBcast.
As a primary target for ransomware campaigns,
is security and testing and performance and scalability.
Risk and compliance.
We can actually automate that.
take that data and use it.
Joining me now is Jamie Norton, Board Director at ISACA, and Rob Clyde, Crypto Quantique and past ISACA Board Chair. And today we're discussing quantum computing and how can cyber professionals prepare. So gentlemen, thank you for joining me and welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure.
Okay, so you've both got a lot of pedigree in this space, a lot of background, so I'm really keen to get into this because one thing that's interesting from a media perspective is quantum. And one thing I'm often hearing in this space, and there was a gentleman out here, as a client of mine, and he was here from the UK, and he's like, I was talking to people in Australia about X, Y, Z, but when I got to quantum, he said people just didn't want to hear it. So I'm really maybe curious to start there. There is a little bit of research that was conducted, and I'll read just for context, and then I'll start with you, Jamie. But for context, ISACA recently conducted a global quantum computing pulse poll among 2,600 tech professionals, finding that 95% of organizations lack quantum computing roadmap. So let's start right there. 95%, Jamie, that's quite a high number. But in saying that, like I said before, I am hearing it's kind of like people are putting their head in the sand. They don't want to hear it. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, and the survey that ISACA conducted did have a reasonable cohort from our region, from Australia, and I think it's not surprising, I guess, the result. I think Australia is well positioned from a quantum perspective. We do have quite a bit of innovation happening on that front. I think when you look at the impacts of the quantum organisations in Australia, that's where we're seeing these numbers come through, where that 5% are all that's really taking steps towards addressing that at the moment. And, I think that's a factor of just the visibility of quantum and what it might bring at the moment. I think it's a factor of all the other things that everyone's doing. And we've got AI and other innovations that have sort of hit us as well. So it's just the workload, I suppose, and the to-do list, which is probably causing some of that as well. And this sort of emerging thought bubble, I suppose, from various sectors where I'm starting to see quantum coming up a little bit more in frameworks and things like what the ACSC is doing and Home Affairs and some of their standards. So it's starting to see some more attention to it, but these numbers aren't surprising. And I think where we're seeing that long-term roadmap is just not there at the moment in our part of the region, and we're looking to hopefully get more attention on that.
And so, Rob, would you agree with Jamie, or what are your sort of sentiments?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with Jamie. I also think this is the risk from quantum computing is something in cyber arenas that we've been talking about for quite some time. So there could be a bit of quantum fatigue and people just kind of not paying enough attention. But there's kind of a corollary to the 95%. We actually had 7% of the respondents that said they had a strong understanding of the new post-quantum cryptography standards that the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology came out with. And once the NIST comes out with standards, those quickly turn into global standards. And so we now have the new cryptography standards to move to, but hardly anybody really knew much about them. And in fact, 44% said they had never even heard about them. That I consider kind of the bigger risk. If we let kind of quantum fatigue get in the way of really understanding that now is the time to move. We've got a chance to really make some steps in the near future so we can be ready for the risk from quantum computing.
So, Rob, I'm just going to stay with you for a moment. You said now is the time to move, but isn't everyone saying that about AI? Like, now's the time, AI is the time, and now we're already we've ditched AI and we're already on to quantum.
All emerging technologies kind of have this. I mean, a few years ago, it was all about now is the time to move to cloud, right? So we always have the kind of that call to action. And I certainly would not suggest that companies pay more attention to quantum computing than they do to AI. Nevertheless, they're closely linked, actually. Quantum computing is likely going to be used in the future as a way to implement AI and certain types of AI. So they're not totally separate. Secondly, cool as AI and as big a revolution as it is, from a security standpoint, AI does not pose the risk of actually breaking the fundamental cybersecurity of the internet. And so the risk is a little bit different. And really, as cyber professionals, we've got to be able to do more than one thing at a time, or we could find ourselves in deep trouble in the next few years.
So I want to keep following this. So Jamie, given your role, pedigree, and background in this space, Rob raised a great point around fatigue. So would you say that people are, we talked about, the cloud era, then we had, virtualization before that, cloud, etc. Do you think people are just sort of a little bit tired of hearing things? And then there's people listening to this podcast going, oh, well, then Rob and Jamie are now talking about something else I got to worry about. Do you think people are just a little bit over it, would you say, especially from an Australian point of view? I mean, we are a little bit more of a reserved market, I would say, instead of like the United States. What are your thoughts around that?
We can be a little bit. I think it's in a slightly different stage of its development to something like AI. That at the moment, quantum from a cyber lens at least sits in the risk to be managed category. So it sits alongside all the other risks that CISOs and security teams are dealing with. And I think the stats are showing there's a reasonable understanding of quantum as a concept. I guess where the stats are showing us is less well developed reaction and taking steps to address that. But so I think there's an appreciation is probably a better word of saying what quantum is, but it's actually addressing those risks sort of now before quantum itself is really a realized innovation in the workforce. Whereas if you take AI, that's very sort of front and center and present. And it also means in the executive and the leadership teams and in the boards, AI is very much the top of the conversation and innovation and business competitive advantage, whereas quantum as a capability isn't quite at that level yet. So we're more addressing risks and sort of trying to get ahead of potential impacts down the track. So I think it's slightly different stages, but it is a risk that cyber professionals should become more aware of and educate themselves, and then actually now start today to take steps to address that risk now rather than waiting for the day when quantum becomes a lot more real and it's actually probably too late then to play catch up.
Yeah, Jamie, I also think part of it is that for years, and ISACA actually was giving this same guidance, we were saying until the guidance to security professionals was until the new post-quantum cryptography algorithms have been standardized and approved, our strongest recommendation was kind of a wait and see, monitor it, follow it closely, maybe do a bit of inventory of where you're using encryption and where you have particularly sensitive data. But primarily it was kind of a wait and see set of guidance. And I think many have not realized that the seminal event we were looking for that would change that guidance, which is the approval of those algorithms, has now occurred. And it's time now to take action.
Yeah, this is interesting. So Jamie, you mentioned before quantum as a concept. So when you say concept, do you just mean that at a high level people kind of understand it? Because when I'm out here talking to people on the front line, some of the most senior people, best tech and cyber professionals in the world, people are kind of getting it, although they've heard about it, they've seen it, and then they're like, now we've got to focus on it. Do you think there's anyone really out there that fundamentally gets it in the full fidelity, or do you think it's still early days yet?
Well, I think there's people out there that understand it very well, and Australia has its share of quantum specialists. I think in the broader sort of cyber industry, Australia is a little bit less aware of quantum as a concept. I think the broad sort of brush of quantum and the promise of exceptionally fast compute and things that go with that, I think that's appreciated, but the intricacies of the risks posed and things, as Rob mentioned, like the fact that NIST has released post-quantum cryptography standards now, I think that's less understood. And so there is an education piece here as much as there is a call to action. That's really what's going to hold us in good stead, is actually being aware of what those risks are and sort of timelines of activity and where we need people to start to move towards.
I interviewed a gentleman a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying, he was a quantum guy, and he was saying, look, still early days, we're not sure whether quantum will be, in terms of quantum computing, will become available to like PCware, when Bill Gates and friends rolled that out to the everyday person. What are your thoughts on that, Rob? Do you have any insight? What do you sort of think in terms of the whole quantum space?
So if we're looking for the day when the average person is going to have a quantum computer in their home, we're a long ways from that. If, on the other hand, you're looking for the day, which is relevant to today's conversation, of when large organizations, governments, maybe perhaps large corporate entities or even hostile entities can afford the 10 to 100 million that a quantum computer is likely to cost and be able to leverage that to break the security of the internet, that might not be so far off. There are a few challenges that still remain before that can occur. So I wouldn't want today's conversation be through the lens of when will the average individual be using quantum computers, because that is irrelevant to the risk to the internet.
All right, so let's move on. Now, there is a stat here, and it's a good jumping point to talk around the stat, which is 62% of technology and cybersecurity professionals said that quantum computing could shatter current internet encryption. So walk me through this. And this is important because when I was interviewing this gentleman about the quantum, he did say, if this happens, then all the other things that we're sort of doing in security just becomes obsolete. So I'm really keen to dive into this more. Who wants to go first?
First, let's walk back a little. I said a little bit about the risk to the internet. So to kind of understand how the internet security works. So when you do banking on the internet, buy goods on the internet, send emails back and forth, we all expect those things to be private and to be secured. They are today. But if you look at the mathematical principle that's being used to do that security, it actually comes down to a fairly simple concept of the computational difficulty of factoring very large semi-prime numbers. In other words, think of a prime number like 15. We can all immediately say, I can factor that. The two primes that go into that semi-prime of 15 are 5 and 3. But if it's a very large prime number, think of hundreds or even more digits that are in that very large semi-prime number that have been created by multiplying two large prime numbers together. That's a difficult mathematical problem. And with today's computers, it would take thousands and thousands of years to actually factor that very large semi-prime. Many years ago, a gentleman by the name of Peter Shor developed an algorithm postulating that if somebody could come up with a quantum computer, and the idea of quantum computers is not new, but the ability to actually implement them is quite new, and came up with this algorithm called Shor's quantum factoring algorithm. To put it simply, with a quantum computer that implements this algorithm, and it does work, it's already been implemented at a small scale. So this isn't theory, the algorithm actually works. All we need is a large and powerful enough quantum computer, and instantaneously, it could break the large semi-prime numbers that are used that allow you and I to communicate securely or allow you to do secure banking on the internet. It would literally break the internet. And the only way to fix that is to move from today's cryptography that we use to protect the internet to what's called post-quantum cryptographic algorithms, or PQC, post-quantum cryptography. And those algorithms have now been approved. So we could begin the process of replacing the cryptography we use today with these newer algorithms that will not break in the face of a quantum computer.
And Jamie, do you have any sort of thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I agree with what Rob has said. I think if we take quantum as a concept, obviously there's a vast potential for the things that it's going to be capable of doing across sort of broader humanity. But, in particular with that vast increase in computational power, particularly around, as Rob said, the ability to factor large primes in the case of Shor's algorithm and break public key cryptography. I think that's sort of at the heart of what we're concerned about. And whilst that, that could be sometime in the next 5 years, it could be 10 years away. No one knows for sure. It depends very much on innovations in quantum, which obviously that's a robust area of innovation across the world. It's impacted by factors like nation states and defense programs and military spending, as well as private sector research and universities. So there's a lot going on in that space. But if there's a breakthrough, our timelines could all of a sudden compact a lot more significant than what we think. And that may not be a breakthrough in the computing aspects of quantum. It could be a breakthrough in the error correction or other areas. So there's a lot of moving parts. And I think the other aspect potentially talk about too is that anything that's data that's breached now and is effectively lost, potentially that data could be decrypted at some point in the future once quantum is a reality as well. So they have this harvest now, decrypt later concept, which is just another risk that we have to deal with in terms of quantum's heading.
Okay, I want to get into this a little bit more. This is really interesting. Okay, so Rob, going back to you then for a moment, and there's something as well you said, Jamie, and I'll come back to you, would be, you said we're in the process now to replacing, but if I just go back a step, and do you think when people, when the internet started, do you think they thought this can't be broken? But now we're saying we start to replace it and it's coming in, it's going to be shattered, to my words earlier. Do you think when people started the internet, they thought like this, and then going back to the process, how long is that process now going to take until it's replaced?
Great questions, Carissa. So interesting enough, when the internet and the design of the internet first came through ARPANET, and we actually hadn't figured out how to do secure transactions yet on the internet. That came a little bit later. RSA was invented in the 80s, in the late 80s, which is the algorithm using large semi-primes that I was discussing earlier, which was used to implement methods to do things securely on the internet. Interestingly enough, the internet advent around 1993, when we really all kind of started using it. Shor's algorithm actually came out shortly after, and it was a big stir. So cryptographers, in other words, the same people who were in charge of, figuring algorithms to protect the internet, knew very early on about the risk of the quantum factoring algorithm. In their estimation, first of all, they didn't yet have new algorithms to implement. They didn't have anything better. And we were all already down the path of implementing that. And secondly, in their estimation, correctly, quantum computers were still decades away. And so that's kind of how we ended up where we are. NIST, so the effort to come up through NIST with the new standardized algorithms began over a decade ago. So this effort to get ready is not new. It takes a while to come up with new algorithms and test those algorithms with the top mathematicians and cryptographers in the world, which has now been done. And people will continue to try to break new algorithms. That's what you try to do, of course. But we've been through this is not a short process, a long process of coming up with these new standards. And at least in my opinion, we're getting them in time so that we can hopefully implement them and protect the internet and have it ready by the time quantum computers can break the internet. Jamie correctly brought up the harvest now, decrypt later problem. So that's an urgent need for companies to consider. If their encrypted data is stolen today and it's still sensitive many years from now when quantum computers are available, it's quite conceivable that data could then be decrypted quite easily. And so that's also, a real risk that we face now.
For remote-first companies, maintaining a strong security posture across distributed teams can be a challenge. That's why thousands of modern remote-friendly firms turn to Vanta. Vanta automates the heavy lifting for ISO 27001, SOC 2, GDPR, and more, keeping you compliant and audit-ready wherever your team logs in from. Visit vanta.com/kbcast. vanta.com/kbcast to learn more. Okay, so that was the point that I wanted to go back and ask Jamie on. So going back to harvest now, decrypt later. So Jamie, what does that mean for organizations? How can they prevent this from happening?
It's a well-known kind of side impact, I guess, of where quantum is heading, is that it's anything that's effectively lost now. And we know that our data as consumers and a lot of organizational data, we saw it with Qantas earlier in this week, data gets lost, it gets harvested by criminals or potentially nation states, and it tends to get aggregated as well. So these data sets don't just get lost and stored in isolated containers. You see over time that these data sets tend to get aggregated. They get traded on the dark market, the dark web. If you look at where our data ends up, it ends up being these really big data dumps or data holdings of billions and billions of bits of data in them, and some of those could be encrypted using current technologies. And we've seen over years gone by that it's a factor of cryptographic algorithms that there's a need for longer key links or a need to change in algorithms as we go through, because those algorithms get compromised and then installed with or get defeated like triple dares. Some of our hashing algorithms like SHA-1 now are no longer strong enough because they've been deprecated. So it's kind of an evolution, although quantum is more a revolution, I guess, that at some point in the future, those data sets that have been lost as breached data sets will become quite easily decryptable if they're currently decrypted. And so that means that passwords and all other manner of data on us personally will be much more accessible to criminals. But if firms are losing large amounts of data now and relying on encryption as a control to reduce the consequence of that I think is misguided, because in the future that data will almost certainly be readable. It's merely a question of the timeline it takes for that to eventuate.
Okay, so do you envision that whenever this timeline is, do you think we're going to see an avalanche of this data being readable? Because, like you said, there's going to come a time where maybe people have been breached, they're holding on to this data, they can just read it really quickly. Are we going to start to see that happen? And as a result of that, people are already becoming a little bit desensitized to breaches now. So what does that sort of mean then in the future?
Yeah, it's an interesting risk to quantify, I guess, because you've got a combination of accepting that in order for that risk to realize, you have to have suffer a breach and you have to have your data as a corporate, released, and what data it is, and the timeliness around that data. If it's realized as a risk, say 5 years down the track, what does that data look like? But for a lot of firms, there's still very substantial risk in that. We're talking intellectual property, we're talking, potentially sensitive user content as well, customer content. So even 5 years down the track there's still substantial value in that data and substantial risk associated with it. So I think it's for each entity or each organization to kind of decide where that risk sits for them. But I think it's something that should actually be considered. We don't know the timelines for quantum, but it's fair to say it could be in the next sort of 5 to 10 years, but it could actually be a lot sooner than that. It could be a little bit longer than that. So with that unknown factor, it becomes hard to manage that risk. But essentially, I think that's part of the reason why we're trying to advocate strongly that decision making and context matters now. So understanding the scale of the issue now, rather than sort of kicking the can down the road and trying to make it a future problem. There's actually risks, very real risks here and now.
And Rob, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. So you mentioned, are we likely to see like a data dump, as we have sometimes seen? That day definitely could come. However, I would consider the more likely initial scenario when that data is able to be decrypted will be that when nation states have quantum computers that are large enough to be able to do so. And they are likely to be the first ones to have it. To be specific, the United States and China are working the hardest on quantum computing. And it's, if I were to project where the most likely source of being able to read harvested data, it's not likely to actually be criminal elements or hacker groups. It's likely to be nation states. And most likely, they probably won't dump that data. They'll use that data for their own purposes. And so I think that needs to be part of the risk consideration. How comfortable are you with that data being understood by a large nation state?
Yeah, this is interesting. Now, I don't know how much you want to, I just want to quickly touch on this because I do think this is important. So going back to your point, nation states leveraging this for intelligence. Do you think it's just going to be whoever gets there first, and I say this in inverted commas and you can't see me, would be, are they the people, are then they're going to, or the country going to win the game in terms of like geopolitics? Because we're already starting to see that with the whole race to AI, and then quantum is sort of coming up closely behind it. What does that then sort of mean for geopolitics moving forward, would you say?
I think it's going to have a huge impact. And yes, I do believe this is whoever gets there first, to a certain extent, wins. Likely be kept quiet, and you will see the ability to understand certain information about adversaries, even allies, even lots of data about individuals will suddenly become readily accessible. Another thing to realize about nation states and cyber breaches, generally when a nation state commits a cyber breach, they try to keep it quiet. So most of those breaches are not discovered, just to kind of keep it, add a little more of the urgency to why, if we would prefer that certain data not be understood by a nation state's government. We need to move sooner rather than later. Eventually, quantum computing will get to the point where you'll have other hostile groups that can afford them, use them, and so on. But I would predict that will be sometime after the first nation state has one. And that nation state will definitely have a global advantage. It will be significant.
So maybe going back to just private enterprises now for a moment. And I know you said there may not be a data dump day, for example, but what does this sort of mean then for private enterprises? So the nation states are leveraging it for intelligence. What are some of more of the risks then for private enterprises? And will, in terms of in Australia, maybe this is more for you, Jamie, in terms of the OAIC, what is that going to look like in terms of fines? Because I've been speaking to people out here in the market post all of these breaches, and it's like, well, we're putting more money into security and technology than ever, but there's still lots of breaches that are happening. And this is just going to allow it to be even easier now. Do you have any thoughts around that?
It's a good question. I think we continue to see the breach sort of landscape, if you want to use that term. It's still growing, and we're still surprised by some of the vectors and even some of the approaches that organizations are getting breached can still be very simple in context of the sophistication that should be sort of sitting there in terms of the control environment against cyber attacks. So it's an ongoing challenge. And I think from a quantum perspective, we will see, as Rob identified, it's the nation state aspect that's probably driving some of this innovation. Competitive advantage or geopolitical advantage, I suppose, is what's driving that. And we've seen that historically in conflicts. The side with the most intelligence has a massive advantage, but that will trickle down. And I suppose there's two aspects. There's the trickle-down aspect, which will start to impact on organizations as the technology becomes more available over the years, once it reaches the point of being able to decrypt data that's breached using old encryption methodologies. But nation states are also going to be interested in a whole range of private sector information, because that gives them the insights they need for their intelligence gathering. So that could be intellectual property. That's obviously a highly covetable commodity, but could also be, simple information on where, some of the country's citizens might be located in different countries, where, political targets, all of these things could be easily gathered out of private sector information. So it's just restricted to kind of the big governments playing amongst themselves. This is a broader context for the community as well. And I think we don't know where that might lead. I suppose there's a lot of different ways that could manifest.
So there's another stat here that I'm going to read out. The report also states that only 5% report having a defined quantum strategy in place. So, Jamie, what would a defined strategy look like in your eyes?
And I think this is a factor of a quantum not yet reaching that level in the executive and the board levels within organizations to be something that's really considered, unlike something like AI, which is very much present in those forums. So I think a strategy for me is, at this point of the life cycle, is nothing too sophisticated or overdeveloped. It's really just a strategy which would include identification of the issue, and then the steps to be taken by the organization to address that, and potentially a timeline as well. So, and again, they're not going to be hard and fast, but at least it's having eyes on how that discovery piece is going to be done. So how they're going to identify where cryptographic assets are in use in the organization, and then what they're going to do about that, including things like education over a period of time. So we're not advocating for urgency in terms of all rushing out and fixing the problem tomorrow, but it's about having this strategy piece which identifies, we acknowledge that this is something we need to look at, and here's how we're going to approach that. And I think that's the piece that a strategy would bring, and then also gives it visibility a little bit of visibility up into that executive level to start that conversation and make sure they're aware of the risk that's posed.
And Rob, do you have anything to add to that as well?
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with everything that Jamie just mentioned. And I would suggest that we are soon going to start see the advent of standards and requirements, much like we have had in the past, to move to the old encryption standards. We are going to see regulations start to come out requiring the movement to the new standards. So this will start to come. You can get ahead of the game now by starting to figure out where your most sensitive data is, especially data that is sensitive for a long period of time. Let me give you an easy example: healthcare data. If you are young and have healthcare data about you, that will be just as sensitive 40 years from now. So it's going to be important to identify that most sensitive data, particularly data that is sensitive for longer than just a couple of years, and start to put a plan together for how you're going to re-encrypt the old data with the new algorithms, the new post-quantum cryptography algorithms, and how you're going to, for new applications and new data, use the new algorithms for that as well.
Okay, there's another stat here, and I want to spend a little bit of time on this because I think this is a really big one. And the stat is that 52% say it will change the skills needs of businesses. So, a couple of things in here. Do you envision that quantum certs will become a new thing? The other, where my mind goes when I ask that question, is there's a lot of people out here, whether they're mums and dads that are not working in our space, that are curious to understand where are the new skills, what do they look like? I think Salesforce reported earlier this year they laid off about 1,000 plus employees as a result of it being driven by AI. So I think a lot of people out here, especially for people if they got kids that are going into university and colleges, they're starting to ask people like myself, hey, well, we're hearing that development jobs, you can't get them anymore, or they're rare as opposed to what they used to be. So I think this is a really big one to touch on, is people are starting to get worried about what are the new skills that look like. And I always say, well, the new set of skills are going to be bred. Problem is, I don't have all of the data to be able to back that up. So I'm going to be relying on both of you to talk through what does this then look like for the new generation or people that are perhaps want to transfer their skills and work more in this quantum space. So Rob, I'm going to stay with you first. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think this is very timely given the way that AI is affecting the job market. First of all, we are going to need to have skills in AI. We're already at the point now where 25% of all tech jobs require an understanding of AI, and that number will only increase. So number one, yes, we talked a little bit about the impact of AI, but I think all of us in technology field and technology related fields need to become more grounded in artificial intelligence. Similarly, quantum computers are going to start to become more common and be used not in isolation. They will almost always be connected to classical computers, but to program quantum computers today and to make good use of them, in fact, even to communicate well with them, requires some understanding of quantum physics, more than most of us have. And so one thing to consider as people are looking to say, what am I going to learn when I go to college? You might consider getting a little more of a grounding in math and quantum physics. Not necessarily get a PhD in them, but at least get a little better understanding of them because they are coming. And I imagine in the future that people who have an understanding of AI and a good understanding of quantum physics and a decent mathematical background are going to do very, very well. If, on the other hand, you are, for example, want to become a product manager I think many of those types of positions are going to become not totally eliminated, but they're going to be consolidated. So you will have way more product managers, or I should say way more products for a single product manager. So you will have them using AI and other skills to be able to get more done, and you simply won't need as many product managers as a for instance. So I would definitely look to try to solidify your career by getting a strong grounding in what's coming, not just what has been.
And Jamie, what are your thoughts or your 2 cents?
Yeah, I think if I put my futurist hat on, I think we're in a fascinating period of human and technology revolution. We've got the AI piece that's really sort of coming into market. And I still have a feeling that we're just at the start of that journey, really, and where that's going to lead. I think no one has a grasped the concept fully yet, but it's going to be in a very different place. I think that most of us will think over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, and that's already having an impact on business. You kind of have to innovate and start to use some of these things in a lot of industries. Otherwise, you're going to get left behind and become uncompetitive. And I think quantum is from a broad sort of strokes perspective, perhaps not something that's going to be felt at the coalface quite as quickly or quite as sharply initially, but I think what it will bring over time as the technology matures is incremental, or an exponential, I should say, increase in the ability to do certain things a lot quicker, the compute power around it. So I think that will bring in its own changes and challenges and will potentially layer on things like AI to give even sort of much more vast capabilities than what we're looking at today. So I think impact on business is almost certain, and it's going to be significant, and that will impact the jobs market and what's required from a skill set. We're already starting to see, and I think quite rightly, that certain jobs will not be as necessary over the next 5 to 10 years as AI starts to take them over. Other jobs more in the tech space, focusing in on those technologies, will become more paramount. And we're seeing for really good AI people who really know the technologies well, they're very much in demand at the moment. So, but other areas of the industry are not. So, but I think from a tech perspective too, as Rob pointed out, understanding quantum is not something we're traditionally trained on. The more traditional compute models with, the traditional silicon CPUs and all the associated things within the technology space, that we're strong on that today, but very few people have skill set in quantum architecture. So I think that's going to become, without a doubt, very, very rich commodity in the future years, much like it is with people skilled in AI today. So for security people, for cybersecurity people, it's really getting across all of those technology aspects. So AI now is one that security people really need to focus in on and understand how it works and how it manifests. And the same will be with quantum. We're going to have to really get under it to be able to understand the risks and how we deal with those.
Yeah, you know what? You might add on that skills aspect. We talked a lot about some of the negative and risk that might come from quantum, but quantum does have a lot to do with AI, and the future will have a lot to do with AI. So one of the challenges we face today is that the large AI data centers require the power of a small city. And that's why you see companies, for example, coming up with the idea of, can we get like small nuclear power plants that we can use and dedicate to our data centers? That's the kind of world we're currently living in. Quantum computing can change that. Quantum computers have a much smaller energy footprint. And so rather than requiring the power of a small city, you might be able to do it with 1,000th of the amount of that power if you were using quantum computers to do much of the AI work. And quantum computers are naturally well suited to many aspects of AI. They are probabilistic in nature. AI is probabilistic in nature. They're great at pattern matching. That's a big part of what AI needs. So large AI companies are already looking for people who are skilled in the background needed to do quantum computing in the future.
Okay, I just want to talk on this a little bit more because I do find this really interesting. So in terms of companies or talent managers or recruitment consultants out there, are these the sort of skill sets that they really need to start in terms of talent pooling, starting to say to the companies that they're working with, this is where we have to invest, this is where we're heading to now? So I feel like there's a little bit of inertia at the moment in the industry. People aren't really sure. I think they are worried about, AI taking our jobs and all those sort of things, probably because certain mainstream media outlets are positioning it that way. Where do you sort of sit with that, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, technology always impacts jobs, and there are always people that are negatively impacted. But I would suggest, in general, technology has actually improved employment levels across the world. The more technologically able countries generally have higher levels of employment and productivity than those that don't. So I wouldn't be scared of the technology in general, and I wouldn't look to try to slow it down because it just makes you less competitive. Having said that, I do think that as individuals and professionals, each of us needs to always be learning. We're not just done with school after college, and we need to continually educate ourselves and even set goals about what we're going to educate ourselves about. For example, set a goal to understand better what the risk is from quantum computing and how these new algorithms work and how you might be able to begin the process to move to those. That will require education, just as we've had to learn about AI, each of us. And so I wouldn't get nervous about it. I would actually jump in with both feet and become engaged and really start to learn about these kind of things. And if I'm new into the job market, I would especially look at how to get educated about these types of things. But I wouldn't spend my time worrying. I would spend my time learning.
And Jamie, did you have anything to add to that?
I agree with everything Rob said. I think there's no doubt that technology can be disruptive in the short term, I guess, and we're seeing that with AI. And I think from my mind, there's no question that it is going to disrupt certain traditional jobs, much like other technologies historically have disrupted jobs, and those jobs no longer exist. But what we do find is that almost every time that happens, humans as a general will move up the value chain and perform other roles within that same sort of sphere, but at a more advanced level, whilst technology is covering off that traditional kind of more basic role. So the thing here is around change and being able to adapt and grow with change. And, I know that gets harder, I suppose, as you get older and obviously more concerning for some people who think the world's changing too quickly around them. But I think in technology, that's kind of at the heart of what we do. We AI for most of us has been last 5 years, maybe not even that, maybe last 3 years. So, and we've had to grow and adapt. And as Rob said, 25% of new tech roles now want that AI capabilities to some degree. So I think it's going to be the same thing with quantum. It's going to be a step change for everyone in terms of having to step up and understand and start to use the technology. And, technologists will just move in that direction as it comes. So I'm not too concerned. I think what we're seeing now a little bit also the broader macro economy is also impacting on jobs. So it's kind of a nexus of that alongside some disruptive technologies like AI that's causing some of the noise we see in the media. But I think there's elements of truth in both of those, I suppose.
And so if we were to zoom out, the question I'm going to ask, and for each of you to answer as a way to conclude, just as a summary perhaps, how would you say we can better prepare for quantum? So Rob, I'm going to start with you, and then Jamie, you're going to round off today's interview.
Yeah, I would say the good news is I think many are actually aware of the risk. So that's a positive from our studies. What we don't seem to be as prepared for is what to do about it. And fortunately, we live in a world now where the new post-quantum cryptography standards are out there. So learn about them. Start to understand how you can take advantage of them. In many cases, that means asking your vendors questions about when they're going to implement those standards, your software vendors, for example, your IoT vendors for devices that might be connecting to your networks. So those things we can start to do now. I would also suggest, attending sessions like this one, learning and becoming more adept at understanding quantum and what it might mean. And of course, we do have resources. ISACA does have a free checklist. We are, a nonprofit that helps people get educated. We do have a free checklist that people can actually go get on our website and use that as a way to get started about next steps relative to quantum computing.
Okay, Jamie, over to you.
I'd echo those sentiments. I think education is key. I think educating both ourselves as technology and security professionals, and also helping to educate your organization where those key touch points are within the cyber area, and also within the leadership teams about the risks, not being alarmist, but just providing that context about where we sit in the journey around quantum and what it means, and some of the key risks that are sort of born out of that. I think that strategy piece we talked about, starting to build a strategy, and again, nothing overly complex. It's really just identifying how you're going to go about, addressing the risks and working through the issues and challenges that the quantum's going to bring. And in terms of where that is, it's that discovery piece, understanding where you have more traditional sort of cryptographic algorithms, particularly public key cryptographic algorithms in your organization, where that data might be stored, and then beginning to look at how you transition that to post-quantum cryptography. I think, fortunately, in Australia, and I imagine the US and other parts of the world are similar, we've done quite a lot of work on identifying where our crown jewels assets are, if we want to use that term. And most of the time, our crown jewels will either be systems that are critical, or more importantly, data that's super critical to the firm. So most organizations know where their core data is, critical data is. So that's where start to lean in on where that data is and how it's protected and how it's cryptographic algorithms used around that data, and that will, I guess, lend itself to then the quick wins you could get around moving to post-quantum. And actually, that's what I'm saying, talking to your vendors and seeing if they're actually implementing those algorithms. And I'm seeing already some vendors I'm working with have got those algorithms now built into their product. So
This is KBcast, the voice of cyber.
Thanks for tuning in. For more industry-leading news and thought-provoking articles, visit kbi.media to get access today.
This episode is brought to you by Mercsec, your smarter route to security talent. Mercsec's executive search has helped enterprise organizations find the right people from around the world since 2012. Their on-demand talent acquisition team helps startups and mid-sized businesses scale faster and more efficiently. Find out more at mercsec.com today.